On behalf of Warbirds of America, I'd like to greet you to the Warbirds in Review 2019, the Saturday morning version. My name is Sam Bass, and we have a short video up here for you to see before we start our presentation, but I would also like to mention a couple of things. This plaza that we're on right now, that's the courtesy of Scott's Miracle-Gro and Jim Hagedorn. This beautiful Quonset hut back here that we're utilizing, that's Fagan Fighters World War II Museum, which you must see. It's out in the middle of nowhere, but it's great. It's in Granite Falls, Minnesota. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and watch the video.
Boys and girls, and older folks too, often wander around near airfields all over the world, fascinated, mesmerized, watching airplanes take off and land. Magic. Once in a while, they are almost certain to see one particular design of plane. They would notice it has a kind of roundish cylinder fuselage, broad wings, 2 engines, and a tail wheel. So the plane's nose points slightly toward the sky, like it's about to take off. The plane may not look like much, but looks deceive. For over 80 years, the plane has been a force in civilian life and in wartime. In 1936, the Douglas Aircraft Company rolled out the first DC-3, it was called, a civilian airliner that led the way in passenger air travel. And when World War II broke out in 1941, military leaders saw that a modified DC-3 could be very useful in combat. Little did they know, the C is for cargo, the C-47 became a workhorse, especially in World War II and later in Vietnam. It flew supplies and troops, did search and rescue and medical evacuation. It dropped paratroopers and inserted special operations forces behind enemy lines. More than 10,000 American C-47s served in World War II, and thousands more variants were flown by American allies. The plane served in every theater during World War II. And June 6, 1944, was the day Allied forces invaded German-occupied France, D-Day. The night before, over 1,000 C-47s dropped 18,000 paratroopers into France in darkness. At dawn the next day, Allies stormed the Normandy beaches, 6,000 ships and landing craft, 11,000 aircraft, and over 150,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. In American history, a few military events are especially in our memories with reverence. Concord, 1775, Paul Revere's Ride. The Civil War, Lincoln, and D-Day. The week of June 6, 2019, thousands commemorated D-Day over France. Many who participated join us today. Morning, everybody. I'm David Hartman, and we're all going to get seated here. Ed, you're at the far end down here. Roger that. Yeah, go. Thanks, John. Excellent. Yeah, great. It's great. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. To introduce, starting next to me, Eric Zipkin. He has 9,000 hours in the air. The Placid Lassie, this is his airplane, and he was director of operations for the anniversary flights over Normandy in June. Next to him, Doug Rosendahl, 10,000 hours pilot hours, 175 different aircraft. He was the lead pilot on That's All Brother. And next to him, Jay Goldenbaum, a retired Air Force colonel, 161 missions in Vietnam as a fighter pilot, highly decorated, including the Distinguished Flying Cross. He and his team flew the Flabob Express airplane at the anniversary. And to his left, the gentleman at your far right, his name is Ed Shames. He's a retired Army colonel, and he jumped into Normandy in 1944. Yeah, so Ed, you are the big wheel. I mean, you're it.
Big deal.
Big deal and big wheel, both. Ed, that jump.
Yes, sir.
What was the preparation to jump, and did you jump at night or in the day?
We jumped at night. Night jump. I was in charge of the sand tables to prepare for the jump for the whole battalion.
What were the sand tables?
Sand tables are replica of what we see when we on the airplane looking down. We're supposed to have a replica of the ground, so we know where we were and know where we're supposed to go, know who we're supposed to be with, and which way to go. But it so happens that the good old Air Force decided that they were scattering us all over the damn place, and there was only one plane out of 49 that hit the drop zone. And I landed in Carentan. Of course, had I known where I was then, I wouldn't be here today, because I would have dropped dead the moment I found out that I was in Carentan. Because I put on the sand tables, avoided all costs, because they had two divisions of Germans in town. When I found out about it, I told the men that was with me that I picked up on the way to our mission. I said, let's get the hell out of here right now. And of course, I brought 18 men to our mission at the bridges that we were supposed to defend.
What was your rank then?
I was a staff sergeant at that moment.
And what was your unit?
When I got back to camp, not to camp, to the bridges, our mission, I was made a second lieutenant on the spot. 4 o'clock in the morning at 6 a.m. At 4 o'clock in the morning.
So you
June
jumped
the
as a
6th.
sergeant and landed as a lieutenant.
Right.
What happened then?
What happened then?
How'd you avoid the 2 battalions of Germans in town?
Well, by sheer luck. By sheer luck and guts. We were determined to hold on to what we were supposed to. Out of the whole battalion, there was only 119 of us there. That was the whole battalion. But we held on, and we waited for, in fact, nobody knew we were there for 3 days. We were the lost battalion. Finally, they relieved us, beach forces relieved us, and then we went into a holding area and waited for further orders.
What does the term Band of Brothers mean to you?
Band of Brothers? It's a nice name. It's something that's Dr. Ambrose came up with, Band of Brothers. From Greek mythology. No big deal.
So when you, from those days forward, how long were you in Europe on the ground?
From those days, we stayed in Normandy until July the 15th. Then we went back to England, at which time I was duly commissioned a second lieutenant.
Ed, from all of us, thank you for the service you provided and helped protect our freedoms.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Ed, you were, Eric, excuse me. Here you were director of operations. How many airplanes were there? Describe what you did with all these airplanes. How many were there, and what were you doing? What was your mission?
Our mission ultimately.
Ooh. Hello? No, you're probably okay. Yeah, John's got one for you. Go. Yeah.
Our mission.
Ron, back.
Nobody wants to hear what I have to say.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, we do. Yeah.
See if your mic's working now.
Test.
Test. No.
All right. Let's see, redundancy here, right? Our mission ultimately was to bring a full squadron of C-47s to Normandy to honor the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. We succeeded in doing that, and then a little bit, we had 15 aircraft that left North America with us, and all 15 aircraft arrived in Europe and were able to participate. We joined another 8 European-based aircraft, so when we flew across the channel on June the 5th, we had 23 DC-3 C-47s that went across the Atlantic.
Wow.
That went across the English Channel.
So now, where was this airplane from here in the States? Where was it based?
The airplane, Placid Lassie, lives in Florida, and so she, like most of the other airplanes, all gathered in the New York City area, in Connecticut, where I live. We spent about a week worth of training and preparation, including trying out our survival gear and a bunch of formation training and really learning how to work together.
Work together?
Hello?
Yep.
Work together as a group. And then we departed on May 19th to go across the Atlantic.
Doug, where was your airplane?
Our airplane's based in San Marcos, Texas, at the Centex wing of the Commemorative Air Force.
And what was the preparation for you getting ready?
Well, we did a tour across the southeast United States to several locations, Andrews Air Force Base, Atlanta, Birmingham, just kind of to build excitement. Ended up in Oxford, to join up with the D-Day Squadron. That's where I arrived, and then we did some pretty serious training at Oxford, to get everybody prepped up for the crossing and so forth, and then we pressed off from Oxford as part of the group.
Right. Hand that back to John, if you would. And John, where is your airplane based? Flaybob?
Our airplane is based at Flaybob Airport in Riverside, California.
Right. How much, to all three of you, how much preparation, how much in advance did it take to make sure these airplanes were in good enough shape to get over there and get the job done? How long did it take, and what you have to do that?
I'll speak for ours and pass it on, but we started preparing for this. I met Eric at Oshkosh, because I come every year, and so does he, and he told me about this absolutely wonderful opportunity to go and do the reenactment for the 75th anniversary. We immediately said we're going. The short answer for you, David, on what it took is we started working for 2 years, put on 2 new engines. A couple of them actually worked, put on a couple of more, rebuilt the airplane, completely gutted it and put in new avionics. So there was a significant amount of preparation that we did before we'd fly.
Doug, what about your airplane? We'll all have to share that, Mike. Yeah. Oh, you're good. Yeah. You're good, Doug.
So That's All Brother had just come out of a major restoration. It was discovered over here in the boneyard at Basler, and when we learned the history of the airplane, and the CAF bought that airplane and put it through basically a zero-time restoration that lasted about 3 years. First flight was in January 31st of 2018, I believe, and so we'd been flying for a year. But it was all the airplanes. I mean, I watched them all across the country, and everybody put a lot of energy into their airplanes in anticipation of this historic event.
Yeah. Eric, what about yours? Yeah.
Well, I echo every other team. It was time, and most importantly was really getting the opportunity to fly the airplanes. Old airplanes don't like to sit, so when you get out and you go fly them, you discover where you've got problems, and you get them up to speed. And so it was really a two-plus year process.
Given the complexity of all that, all three of you, where'd the funding come from?
The funding ultimately was each individual team funded their crossing of the Atlantic. So there were a number. Each airplane was a little bit different. In our case, it was several benefactors that saw the value of our mission and contributed donations to make that happen. Some other aircraft, it was Kickstarter campaigns and selling T-shirts. So it was really but it was a privately funded, individually funded
community. Yeah.
Exactly, a community event.
Ed, you raised your hand.
I'd like to say something about the fact that we were scattered all over the place, as much as 50 miles away from our drop zone where we were supposed to be, some of us. But it wasn't a bad thing after all, because the Germans first put out a bulletin that as many as 200,000 paratroopers has descended on Normandy. Actually, it was 30,000. And we scared the hell out of them. When they saw us, they ran, and they ran fast. So that's it.
Hey, hand the mic back to John, if you would. Hey, John, and all three of you, describe the trip across the pond. How did you get from Connecticut with all that preparation? How many airplanes were there, and what was the route to get you all to England?
Well, I'm going to give it back to Eric for that, but I do want to say, here's a quick plug. We would have never made it without Eric Zipkin sitting over here to my right. I can't say enough about Eric. Eric, again, I have a military background, and I know a true leader when I see one. And there was no doubt that Eric picked up the leadership role immediately, and in some pretty tough times, carried the ball every time, every way. A hard-working guy, a smart guy. And I'm going to let Eric tell the story, because actually I crossed the pond in the back of a 747 drinking a martini. So, as I told our crew, been there, done that. I'm not putting on an exposure suit. I've done that before. So I got to engage in all European flying, which was great. But a pitch for Eric. You cannot say enough, all of us that flew, about who he is and what he did for all of us. Thank you, Eric.
I'll just echo that. You know, a lot of you know a little bit about Warbirds and the people who fly them, and I said from the get-go, flying a DC-3 across the North Atlantic was a pretty straightforward operation, and it turned out to be an incredibly easy thing. We flew the same airplanes on the same route to the same destination as the kids did 75 years ago, and what we did had nothing in common with what they did. We had 50,000 hours of flight experience in our cockpit. They were lucky to have 500. We had a bucket full of GPSs. They had a brand new navigator fresh out of nav school looking through a star dome in the top of the airplane. We had 3 different computer weather models that we were comparing in the weeks and months leading up to this to get comfortable with the weather, and it was dead accurate. We knew where the ice was, but more importantly, we knew where it wasn't. And we went into Narsarsuaq with absolute certainty that we were turning up the right fjord to get to that destination, because if they made the wrong decision, they ended up in the rocks. And so while we imitated what they did, it had nothing in common with the courage that it took for those kids to launch off from Goose Bay to Narsarsuaq onto Reykjavik and then Prestwick, Scotland. So it was an incredible trip. And I'll echo what John said about Eric. Again, these 15 groups of people that are passionate about their airplanes and the missions that we tell often have opinions. And while I said it was a fairly easy technical thing, managing, I said it was a psychological experiment. It was going to turn out to be managing the egos of all these people. And Eric's leadership managed that so well, and we came together as an incredible team and got to know some people that'll be just lifelong friends. And 15 groups of people that spent 2 years getting their airplanes ready raised $150,000 to $250,000. That sorts out to a pretty high class of people, and I was just honored to be a part of it.
Wow. Eric, your ears burning?
Yeah, my ears are burning. Thank you guys. My job was made a whole lot easier by those 15 teams. One of the most important things that came of this, in addition to honoring the veterans and honoring the events, was really showing that we can bring disparate groups of warbird operators and even civilian aircraft operators together, and it's really a great template for the future to keep the aircraft flying. Going across the Atlantic, as Doug described, we left the Northeast. We went to Presque Isle, Maine, and then on to Goose Bay, Newfoundland. From there, most of the aircraft went to Narsarsuaq in southern Greenland, and then Reykjavik, and ultimately Prestwick, Scotland. There were a couple airplanes, because of weather and because they had a little bit more range, went all the way up to Sondrestrom near Thule, Greenland, and were able to continue the flight that way. But as Doug said, it's the same geographic points, but our job was made a whole lot easier by 75 years worth of technology.
There's one other person that needs credit for this. Eric located a young Coast Guard helicopter pilot up in Alaska named Kevin Riley. And Kevin volunteered to help us with logistics, and he too was an amazing leader, and he brought a professionalism and a confidence, and he went and did research on DC-3s. When we were talking about immersion suits, I said I'd rather have a 9mm. The result's the same and it's quicker. But he did research and found that the C-47 is really an incredibly seaworthy airplane, and he had lots of examples of airplanes that were successfully ditched in the open ocean, to the point where he had a picture of 3 guys standing in the door with a raft right there waiting for the airplane to sink to step in the raft. And he assured us if we got in the raft, the Coast Guard would be there to get us. Wow. And that added a lot of confidence to us in this mission. And so Kevin Riley, and he was with us for almost a month, took leave, and I think the Coast Guard matched some of his leave because they figured it was better to have us have some adult supervision than go on our own.
Just a slight interruption. The Coast Guard doesn't get nearly the recognition and respect that it is due every day, every night, around this country and around the world. Just take 2 seconds and let's hear it for the U.S. Coast Guard. Ed.
I'd like to get back to Normandy for a few minutes.
Okay. We're getting there.
I know that's old stuff to you people, but I'd like to tell you how I'm here. I think I told you a few moments ago that I was in charge of making the sand tables, and I was told by my commanding officer, the battalion commander, to stay at the tent where the sand table was for the last minute for anyone to know where they were when they hit the ground at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. When they said wait until the last moment, they will send a Jeep to pick me up. They did. I got to the plane. I was on number one plane of 47 planes of the battalion. The commanding officer, who respected me quite a bit because I knew what I was doing, I worked very hard at my job. No big deal, I was supposed to. Anyhow, he was at the door, and I was getting ready to put my stuff on. The stuff was on the ground, parachute, everything else that I was going to jump with. He said, Shames, there's a correspondent that's sitting in your seat next to me, and you're going to be assigned to a different airplane. Well, I was very disappointed because I usually sat next to the colonel when I jumped because he depended on me quite a bit of where we were and what we were doing. No big deal. That was my job. I was not smarter, brighter than anyone else, but that was my job, and I did my job well. I wanted to do it. So anyhow, I was nervous as hell. We were getting ready to get our tail shot off in Normandy, and there I was in the middle of nothing. So he said, go to so-and-so plane. Today, I still don't know what plane I was on. Nobody has a manifest to show the plane that I was on. I can't even prove that I jumped into Normandy. But anyhow, the Jeep took me to this airplane, and of course, I was nervous, so was everybody else, I think, unless they were crazy as hell. Anyhow, the jump master said, Shames, you get into the back of the plane, which actually was the front of the plane, and when the light goes on, the green light, start pushing and get everybody out. He knew who I was, and I knew who he was, but that was it. I didn't know the plane I was on. It was dark. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. So we took off. We were ready to go right then. So when we got over Jersey and Guernsey, in the middle of the channel, we got flak, but it was too far away from a plane to make any effective use of it at all. So nothing hurt us. And we got across the channel right on the mainland, and all hell broke loose. If you ever been to a ocean view area like amusement park, night of fireworks, that's what it looked like. Stuff was all over the place. So we ran, and of course, when the pilots saw all of this stuff, they moved around, and I don't blame them. Of course, if I were in the cockpit, I would have done the same damn thing. Anyhow, about 2 minutes, 3 minutes later, the green light came on, and I got up, everybody got up and started pushing, and I was shoving. We got just about everybody out, and the guy in front of me, he was carrying a 60-millimeter mortar on him. Of course, I had my maps, I had my rifle, I had everything else. I had grenades. We were carrying spare rounds of ammunition for the machine gun because we had no supply whatsoever. We had to use all of our men for supply people, mules. So about the time we get ready to jump, the guy in front of me slipped on the floor. Took me about, I guess, 3 or 4 seconds to get him on his feet. Got him on his feet, hooked up, back hooked up, kicked him out of the airplane, and I jumped. Like I say, where I jumped, I had no idea in the world. And all I know, it took me about, I guess, 90 seconds to get down. It seemed like 3 hours because stuff was coming through my parachute, and you could hear the bullets and shrapnel coming through my parachute. No big deal. Everybody else had the same thing. A lot of people got killed on the way down. Finally, I didn't hit the ground at all. I hit a bunch of cows, as I said, and they start mooing. So I figured, I said, hell, if they start mooing, they must be ashamed. The Germans didn't know what was going on, so I started to moo too. Finally, I cut myself out of the horns of the cows and so forth, got on the ground, had no idea where I was at all. None. Like I said before, had I known I wouldn't be here now, I'd have dropped dead right then. Finally, I picked up about 18 men total. I knew exactly where I had to go because they had tracer planes up in the sky. As you see tonight, the astronauts in the shade of the sun. They had things to tell us north and south. They had tracer planes. So I knew I had to go northwest. So I started northwest. Finally, about 5 minutes, I told these guys, I said, look, we don't know where we are. We better find out. These people in Normandy do know anything about the area. They're farmers. They know everything. We better find out where we are so we know how to get to where we want to go. Well, finally we picked out this place. We didn't know whether it was a block, anti-aircraft block or what, but anyhow, I knocked on the door like it was Sunday morning, and the farmer came to the door with his wife, and I forgot that a lot of these guys had black faces and true cuts, mohawk cuts, so it looked like hell. Scared the hell of the woman, scared the hell of the farmer. She started screaming, and I grabbed her by the mouth and put her down on the floor, and I said to the farmer, direction. We found out a few words before we went into Normandy. He said, oui. So I pulled out a map, and I said, St. Mary Église, and he pointed, oui, St. Mary Église. I said, oui. I said, St. Côme de Mont. He said, oui, St. Côme de Mont. I oriented the map. I finally said, Brevan. He said, oui. Then I said, Carentan. He knocked on the ground, on the floor. Oui, Carentan. So I said, Carentan. He said, oui. I said, oh my God, we're in Carentan. So I said, boys, we better get the hell out of here right now. So we started out. Finally, we passed a bunch of woods, followed the river up to the bridges. A colonel came out of the woods, Colonel Johnson of the 502nd. He said, Sergeant, he said, do you know where we are? I said, yes, sir, I know exactly where we are. He said, show me. Pulled out a map, had a flashlight, I showed him. He took about 2 or 3 of my men and went one way, and we had to go the other way. And that's finally when we got up to the bridges, and that was the first day we had. But as I said before, the Germans thought 200,000 of us landed in Normandy, and it scared the hell out of them. Thank you very much.
Ed, thank you.
Yes, sir.
And to introduce one of his compadres from that day, Rene Kepperling of the 5th Ranger Battalion. Where are you, sir? You are here? They were here. Well, they were here. Thank you. Hey, back to John. John, talk about us when you got to England. What happened when you arrived in England? How much preparation, how much, how many activities and so on?
You know, it was fairly well organized when we got to Duxford, England, which is an airport run by the Imperial War Museum. And again, Eric put up rapidly a pretty good flying program for us. We were a cooperative venture with a European organization, Dax over Normandy, who
and Dax refers to
Dakotas. That's what the Europeans call C-47s. make a long story short, their organization was not quite as good as Eric's, and soon Eric kind of took the ball and set it up. But the bottom line was we did many formation flights, showed our aircraft off, continued to practice to get ready for parachute drops, and eventually the flyover over the presidential flyover over the memorial in Normandy.
How many airplanes actually dropped paratroopers? Did all of you do that?
Of the 23 aircraft, roughly half of them were equipped to drop paratroopers.
Right. And they dropped them at night or during the day?
No, we did the drops during the day. We decided, just like the same thing, we decided to use GPSs instead of newly minted navigators and sextants. We chose to drop during the day. And the mass parachute drop was in the afternoon of June the 5th over a town called Saint-Ravin.
To all of you, what was this experience like for all of you personally when you took off from England to fly over Normandy, over the Channel? What was that experience like for each of you?
I guess I have the mic, so I'll speak for you.
Yeah, go.
One of our crew members said something very simple, but I think it's very telling. We're flying with ghosts.
Wow.
And that each and every time we know that we're flying with ghosts. The people that flew our aircraft, jumped out of our aircraft, our D-Day veteran aircraft, are airplanes that actually did fly on D-Day. But especially when you're going across the Channel, especially when you're flying across the hallowed ground that is where all of this took place, you really feel those ghosts with you.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have nearly enough time to cover all the emotions that on this trip, but as a pilot, I mean, one of my longtime bucket list items was to fly a Warbird across the North Atlantic, and that was a neat experience. Certainly flying down the beach at Normandy on June 6th, over the American cemetery with 14, I think we had 13 or 14 airplanes in that formation, was an emotional highlight. The Berlin airlift piece was really incredible to see. One of the things that struck me was American ingenuity and exceptionalism. Anybody would have said D-Day can't be done. We had 15 airplanes, or of American airplanes, 23 total, and the logistics that it took to launch those was huge. To imagine the magnitude of managing a mission with 800 airplanes is just beyond comprehension. Just literally, I mean, you'd say it was impossible, and yet American ingenuity and got it done. The Berlin airlift, there's no way that the Americans can supply 2.2 million people for almost a year, over a year, with food and fuel with airplanes, and yet American ingenuity and exceptionalism did it. So, an incredible feeling of pride of what Americans can accomplish. And the fact that we build over 10,000 of these airplanes in short order, just so many overwhelming emotions. And finally, I would say, as an EA member and AOPA member, having the opportunity to fly our airplanes in European airspace for 6 weeks, we enjoy an astronomical amount of freedom in America. But slowly but surely, it's being eroded by user fees and all those other things. And I come home strongly dedicated to make sure that we gin up the support we need to keep those things at bay, so we can continue to have the freedom to fly in America as we do here today.
And besides the 800 airplanes, 150,000 troops.
Absolutely.
Biggest invasion ever. John?
David, the thing that was absolutely emotional for me was on June 6th, and many of you may have seen some media coverage of it. I was privileged to fly in the formation of 13 aircraft that flew over the American cemetery on June 6th over President Trump and President Macron from France. Prior to that, and Eric was the flight lead of the whole thing, and I was back in number 4, but prior to that, it was a beautiful day, very much like today, not European at all. And we took off from Cannes Airport and formed up into this giant formation. It looks giant today. It was nothing like what you guys did in D-Day, but in our own little regards, it was pretty big. And then we flew in a holding pattern from Utah all the way down basically to Ponduhak. It turned around and flew back. So for an hour and a half in preparation for the flyover, we're flying over the beaches 75 years later that these brave men jumped on, okay? And when we finally left the initial point and flew over the American cemetery, it was a sea of people, and all the beaches were absolutely clogged with people to be there for the 75th anniversary. In fact, the roads leading into the beaches, you could see 100 tour buses parked 3 miles away where people were forced to walk down to the beach. And there were vehicles, and there were landing craft, and there were many, many people, and it was just an astounding thing to see from the air. But to me, the question about what did it mean emotionally, you know, my first job in the world was to go into combat, and I did a couple of tours doing that. And then to have the link from the generation that preceded me, and I do believe they're the greatest generation, the ones who jumped in, to be able to fly 75 years later in a formation to honor them was deeply moving to me. And I had a real link from our generation, at least, to your generation.
Ed, yes, sir.
I thought I would say that the plane that hit the target that night was the command plane of the battalion, and it landed right in the middle of a bunch of SS troopers. Half of the men on that plane were murdered, including the commanding officer of the battalion, and half of them were captured. The whole plane. That's the one that I was supposed to be on. I met most of them that came back from the POW camps after the war. I made sure, because they were the people that I was working with in the command of the battalion. I wanted to meet them, fight. Our battalion commander, when they pulled him down from the trees, his feet never did land in Normandy. He landed in a tree near Carentan, and the Germans used him for target practice. They had 169 bullet wounds and bayonet punctures in his body. And when we found that out, we were hard to get along with, I'm going to tell you.
Thank you, Ed.
Now, also, the first night, to give you an idea, give you perspective, out of the whole regiment, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 35% of the officers never saw action because they were either killed, wounded, or captured. 35% of the officers. Every company commander in the command, every company commander in the regiment will put out of service. 30% of all of our men were either killed, captured, or wounded. So we didn't realize what we really had until we got back to England and we had the first formation in our barracks, empty barracks and so forth. But then, of course, it struck us that we had a hell of a job. But they expected 60% casualties. So we did pretty good.
You know, when you think about it, how many times will we hear a first-hand account of what happened at Normandy? And we've just heard it right now.
One thing,
Eric?
one quick thing.
Quick.
Okay. I was over Normandy 39 times, 38 voluntarily. I never did go to the cemetery until about 10 years ago because I could not go into that cemetery because most of our people were buried there. But finally my wife convinced me to go in, and I had one hell of a time. Thank you very much for everything.
Ed, thank you. Ed, how old are you?
How old am I?
Yes, sir.
67. 97 years old. Big deal. Big deal. Good vodka.
Good what?
Good
Good vodka?
Martinis.
Good. The bar.
Martini.
Never mind. So, Eric,
That's
listening to the three
I'm
of
finished.
you discuss how meaningful this all was to you emotionally, and then hearing this, to what extent does this even add to the emotionality when you hear this firsthand account of what went on there?
I'm feeling emotional right now.
Good.
It really is extraordinary. My father was a World War II veteran, and I grew up with the stories and this history and being part of it, and to feel that we're some small way contributing towards bringing that history forward. It's a bit overwhelming at times.
Doug mentioned Berlin. Eric, tell us, it wasn't over when you finished the Normandy anniversary. You went to Berlin. What was that?
So, yes, it wasn't over. Not only is this year the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion, it's also the 70th anniversary of the Berlin airlift. So after the events in Normandy on June the 9th, we flew the entire group, or most of the group, to Wiesbaden, the Army Air Base in Germany, and we participated in commemoration and honoring of the Berlin airlift. We actually had Colonel Gail Halverson, the original candy bomber, fly with us as our honorary crew member, and actually he ultimately flew Placid Lassie, and quite well for anyone actually, and especially somebody in his 90s. But it was equally moving because of and Doug spoke to this a little bit, of the exceptionalism, and really helping all of us understand and appreciate the place that as a country we have placed ourselves in the world, and that started on D-Day and the build up through D-Day and winning the war, and it really has continued through the Berlin airlift and in the subsequent years. It's really makes you feel good to see not only the sacrifice, but also what a humanitarian mission can do.
Eric, Doug, John, Colonel Ed, thank you all very much. What a privilege to be with you today. And welcome, please, Sam Bass, who's got over 35,000 hours of pilot time and 50 years of safe flying. Sam, start us off with questions that have of everybody.
Well, a lot of time is with him.
Was that a good thing?
It's a good thing. We had a good time. Tell us a little bit about your airplane here. I realize it's designed primarily was primarily for an airline. It was the first airliner, I think, that could make any money. The rest of them were all subsidized. But tell us about how well this adapted for military use.
Well, as somebody in the airline industry, I'm not sure that anything in the airline industry actually ever makes money, but it was closer. Yes, the DC-3 was built, in the mid-1930s as a civilian airliner, and when the war came, it was probably the most efficient transport, whether it be passengers or of cargo. So it was quickly, really as like the rest of our country individually, put on olive drab and was made into the C-47 cargo aircraft, and it proved to be the backbone of our logistics. And logistics ultimately is what won the war.
Okay, how about the power plants on the airplanes?
So this airplane has the Pratt & Whitney 1830 dual-row radial engine. The original DC-3 had the Wright 1820. And what happened is when they militarized the DC-3, the 1820s were being used in the bomber aircraft, and they couldn't spare them for the transport. So they went to Pratt & Whitney and said, "What do you have that's close?" And they ended up with the 1830. So a wonderfully reliable engine and bulletproof. It is, however, a little bit heavier than the 1820 aircraft.
Horsepower is about the same, though, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, how about the fuel range? You got two fuel configurations in these airplanes?
We've got several different configurations, but the standard one is 800 gallons of fuel, which is good for about 8 hours of flying time. Typically, if you're carrying a heavy load, you don't carry that much fuel. But when you need to go somewhere a long distance, like across the Atlantic, you have that range there.
How about the history of your particular airplane?
So Placid Lassie served with the 74th Troop Carrying Squadron. She towed a glider for the 82nd Airborne on D-Day, and then continued on, really kind of following the progress of the 101st and our advance across Northern Europe. Participated in the siege of Bastogne, the Operation Market Garden, and then ultimately the ultimate crossing of the Rhine. After the war, like most most C-47s, she was sold off as scrap. As surplus, and was picked up by an airline on the Pacific Northwest, and she spent the next 30 years operating as an airliner. We ultimately found her in the weeds in North Georgia, in Covington, Georgia. Very well preserved, but a little bit neglected. And in the course of 8 weeks, we got her flying again and brought her here to Oshkosh in 2010 for the 75th anniversary of the DC-3 type. And ever since then, we've been operating her and as a flying restoration and bringing her to share her with as many people as we can.
So the initial airplane, it was named the Placid Lassie?
Yes, actually, thank you for reminding me. So initially, we did not know her name was Placid Lassie. We knew the serial number and the markings of the aircraft. And in 2014, we went over to Normandy for the 70th anniversary of D-Day. And when we landed in France, a Dutch gentleman came running out of the crowd and says, "I know your airplane, I know your airplane." And I said, "Well, that's very nice. We know our airplane, too." He says, no, here's a picture of your airplane. And he pulls out the picture from the unit history, the unit yearbook. It says Placid Lassie right on the side, and idling Ada on the engine. I said, "Well, where did you get this?" He goes, "This is your airplane. It's on the cover of the unit history, and I know your crew." I said, "We'd love to know who the crew is." He goes, "No, your crew, he's in California. Ed Tunison is the radio operator of your airplane, and he's alive and well in California." So I sent an email almost immediately, and I got a response very, very quickly from Ed, and he found out that he was very alive and well and ready to travel. So we put him on an airliner and flew him over to Normandy, or over to England, as quickly as we could. And he told us about the story of Placid Lassie. So Placid Lassie is the original name. She had that name because she was so quiet and calm. They would warm up the airplanes every morning, and she was so smooth and quiet that they called her the Placid Lassie. And then the engines, Eager Eileen and Idling Ada. Idling Ada was named after the crew chief's wife, and Eager Eileen was named after Ed Tunison's wife, which was a very, I think, an embarrassing story that he would tell to everybody in England about how, it's Eager Eileen and his 70-year-old son is standing next to him and said, "Dad, that's Mom you're talking about."
Now, Eric, you are a Warbird pilot, and you've got a lot of experience flying Warbirds and instructing. How can you compare this airplane flying to some of the other Warbirds you've flown?
I would say that she was built really for a purpose, and she does that purpose extremely well. She flies straight and level, extremely smooth, extremely stable. In the kind of the Warbird community, the Warbird world, where we're doing a little bit more maneuvering and flying in close formation to try to display the aircraft for the crowd, she's a little bit more of a handful. She's not a T6 or even a Twin Beach for that matter. But she makes you work for it, and it's all the better for it.
The paint job.
Well,
D-Day stripes. Yeah.
how about your paint job?
Our paint job are the original markings of our aircraft, and the stripes, the black and white stripes, are what are known as the invasion stripes, and those were to distinguish our aircraft from the enemy aircraft, and not get shot down over the beaches.
Does it have any quirks as far as flying? How about crosswinds?
She's a lot easier than some. It's just tailwheel airplane, so crosswinds are always, like any tailwheel airplane, you're always flying the airplane until you shut it down and put chocks on it. But she's the DC-3 is a nice, solid, forgiving airplane. And look, if 200-hour lieutenants could fly them in Normandy, then I think ultimately we can kind of figure it out here.
It's hard to imagine that they were flying these airplanes with so little time,
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I want to thank all of you for coming. And also thank you people for coming. And I'd like to remind you that we have we have some coins here. We've got actually we have time for a couple of questions and answers. Anybody have a question you'd like to ask? Here we do.
How
And
old
there's
were
one
the
up here, Kyle.
pilots? Sorry. How old were the pilots when they flew over Normandy? How old were those men that were pilots?
The pilots in Normandy were generally between 18 and 21 or 22 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm curious, once you left the farmhouse, how long did it take you and how far was it to where you had to go to the bridges?
What was your question?
I can tell you, Ed. Once you left the farmhouse, how far was it, and how long did it take to you to get to the bridges?
Hour and a half.
Hour and a half. Yeah.
Hour and a half.
Kyle.
Yeah.
Up to the top, Kyle.
Who were the paratroopers that jumped out in the June reenactment? Where did they come from?
Oh, great question.
That's a very, very good question. So the paratroopers, a little bit like us who operate the Warbird aircraft, are people who are passionate about the history. They came from everywhere, all around the world. They're individual groups that do the reenactors that do commemorative parachute jumps all throughout the world. So it was a disparate group, but we had about 250 of those people that jumped. We actually, I totaled it up. We did a number of other jumps throughout Normandy, and I think we had about 250 paratroopers that jumped out of our individual aircraft throughout the 5 days we were in Normandy.
You know the age range?
The age range, everything from 18 years old to in their 70s. And actually, we had a couple. I believe at least one veteran who jumped over Normandy as well.
Oh.
Okay. One last question.
It is a cargo plane. How much spare equipment and parts did you carry with you? Engines, wheels, brakes?
We figure that each airplane had probably close to 1,000 pounds worth of spares. Nobody took an engine. We had wheels, tires, all the accessories, a couple cylinders per airplane. So it was probably between 500 and 1,000 pounds per airplane.
Thank you, folks. We'd like to invite all of you people to join Warbirds of America. Obviously, most of the people that are our members don't own Warbirds, but we would like to have your support. We also have a merchandise center over here and a gift shop. We'd like for you to visit it. And also, we have a little pretty lady here with a straw hat and somebody else. Well, she's going to be over here. But we have challenge coins for our veteran. The challenge coin, if you're a veteran, if somebody gives you a challenge coin and you don't have it, and they ask you for it, or somebody else asks you for it, then you have to buy everybody a beer. So if you take one of these coins, realize what kind of liability you're taking. So the lady's handing over is right over here, and thanks again for coming, folks.